show. It's being recorded. I'm Karen Hollis, the director of the Cultural Studies program at Villanova, also a member of the English and Global Interdisciplinary Studies departments. And today we have an exciting discussion coming up with Professors Adolph Reed and Jennifer Ponce de León, who will be speaking to us about race, class, and imperialism. Let's see, our sponsors, as I mentioned, the Cultural Studies program and also a Villanova student group, the Global Social Justice group on campus, and the Critical Theory Workshop, which takes place every summer at universities in Paris and is directed by Professor Gabriel Rockhill in the Villanova Philosophy Department. We'll put links to these things in the chat in just a little bit. Our plan for the hour includes presentations of about 10 to 15 minutes by each of our two speakers, followed by maybe 15 minutes or so in which they'll sort of respond to each other. And then we'll open it up for Q&A from everybody out there who I hope will have plenty of questions for our speakers. So let's get started. Let me first introduce Dr. Jennifer Ponce de León, a bilingual Chicana scholar from Colorado who's lived in Buenos Aires for several years and spent time researching in Mexico for her work. She has degrees in literature, art history, and American studies, and has also worked as a curator. She's now associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also faculty in Latin American and Latinx studies and comparative literature departments. She's the author of a recent book, Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War, which demonstrates how recent works of experimental literature, visual art, and performance by Latin American and Latinx artists have been influenced by left social movements and popular uprisings in the United States, Argentina, and Mexico. So Professor de León, welcome back to Villanova.
Thank you. Should I go ahead and start, or are you gonna?
Yeah,
okay, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much for the introduction, Karen, and thank you very much for having us here. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm really thrilled to be speaking along with Adolph, and because I have enormous admiration for his work and have learned so much from it. So I wanted to start by just talking about some of the reasons why I think his work is so important, and then talk about how it connects to my own research and my own recent projects, which are more in fields of Latin American and Latinx studies, of contemporary immigration, and of contemporary cultural production. So I think some of the things I just wanted to emphasize that I think are so important about his work, and that were also highlighted in the article that I know some of the audience here read in preparation for this talk, are the points that Adolph makes about ideology being pragmatic and grounded in material practices, and then it must be understood as part of the social totality. So this Marxist perspective stresses that racial ideologies, which cannot be separated from racist practices, have evolved as a constitutive element of social relations that are anchored in the capitalist mode of production. And as Adolph argues, these and other ideologies of ascriptive difference, that is, ideologies that impute essential qualities to groups of people in order to sort them into hierarchies, function to legitimize capitalist social relations by naturalizing them. This operates in regard to concrete social relations in concrete contexts, and the fully historical and pragmatic character of racial ideologies is what accounts for their flexibility and variance across space and time. Now, I think these insights have been and this approach to thinking about race as it operates within capitalist class relations have been very important for my research. For example, in my recent work, on US immigration policies, anti-immigrant racism, it has helped me to understand how racism has operated in tandem with practices of extra economic coercion, such as state and parastate violence, in the formation of labor markets for US capital, and particularly in controlling immigrant workers. There's a lot of wonderful scholarship on this history, but I would really especially recommend the book, No One is Illegal by Justin Akers Chacon and Mike Davis. And in the beginning of this book, there's a section written by Mike Davis that I think really illustrates very effectively the kind of flexibility and pragmatism of racial ideologies as it pertains to the hyper-exploitation and control that's exercised upon immigrant workers. And it's a kind of episodic history of kind of successive assaults against immigrant workers in California, starting from the mid-19th century into the present, looking at racist ideologies as well as kind of forms of vigilante violence organized successively against Chinese workers, Japanese workers, Filipino workers, Mexican workers, but also against the IWW and also against labor organizers. And this kind of history is one that really shows the kind of function of the mobilization of racism to break labor movements, to criminalize them, to divide workers, and the kind of just looking at the history and the kind of variance of racial ideologies that have been used, and then the variance in groups that have been targeted and why they've been targeted at specific moments, really, I think, helps us understand why this kind of materialist understanding of racism is so important. Because this history really cannot be understood either by positing some kind of trans-historical racist structure that exists outside of these class structures, or by looking to individuals' attitudes or psychology. Because really to understand what is at stake in these racist practices or why some groups have the power to enforce them on others really requires an examination of the class struggles in which racist practices have their meaning and in which racist ideologies emerge. And I think this is very much the case for more recent discourses that legitimize the repression and hyper-exploitation of immigrant workers, but which very studiously avoid references to familiar signifiers of race. Instead, in our contemporary moment, we often see discourses about security and criminality doing the kind of legitimizing work that we're talking about. But again, it is crucial that we don't end our analysis with exposing the fact of racism or just tracing the intricacies of racial ideologies, because that type of descriptive work will not necessarily help us understand the social relations in which these practices are anchored. Instead, for example, if we analyze contemporary anti-immigrant racism as it operates within the political economy of the US, we can come up with much more useful analyses. These would address, for example, how the legal and ideological construction of immigrant labor as a distinct category of labor works to make it super exploitable by, among other things, making immigrant workers isolated, tightly controlled, and denying them rights accorded to citizens. And we would also have to understand how the super exploitation of one sector of the working class works to put downward pressure on wages for all workers. This type of analysis would also require us to address how immigrant labor pools have been organized in different ways historically, be that via guest worker programs or via illegalization, and how these different modalities have also utilized distinctive racial ideologies. Just for the difference between, let's say, at some moments constructing Mexican workers as tractable sources of labor and other moments as potential criminals, right? And I think the contemporary illegalization of some immigrant workers and mobilization of racism against them must be understood within these broader dynamics of class struggle. And we can also must see how the kind of see them as part of the expansion in the US since the 1970s of labor regimes in which workers have no right to organize or negotiate a wage, which includes prison labor regimes and workfare in addition to illegalized immigrant labor. And furthermore, we would have to look at the class struggles that incite international migration in the first place. And in the case of Latin America, US imperialism, of course, has been a major factor in this regard, be it through militarism, overthrow of governments, as in the case of Honduras, or via the economic conditions created by US and transnational elites that force people off their land or from their homes in order to survive. So my point here is that the racialization of immigrant workers cannot be abstracted from the historical class struggles in which this racism does its practical work. And doing so may produce moral expose, but not the kind of analysis that can form the basis of strategic politics. And Adolph has been so right to insistently mark out the difference between moral expose and useful analysis. And in doing that, Adolph's work, I think, does not only distinguish between correct and incorrect modes of analyzing racism. Crucially, he identifies the class character and social function of contemporary ideologies that extract racism from class struggles and attribute historical causality to racial ideologies in and of themselves. And he argues that in the US, the dominance of these ideologies about race has been a symptom of the triumph of neoliberal ideology, which naturalizes class relations, reduces the critique of social inequality to the critique of racial disparity, and suggests that justice could be achieved via the removal of impediments to equal participation in markets. So it shouldn't come as a surprise then that these type of ideologies he critiques are what dominate political discourse, corporate media, and the intellectual production at US universities. And again, I want to emphasize this is not a matter of correct versus incorrect only a matter of correct versus incorrect ways of conceptualizing, historicizing racism. It is a matter of recognizing that these anti-racist discourses, in fact, are on the side of reaction as they function to shore up the power of elites that is maintained through racial brokerage politics and the structures of racial liberalism. And so from that, I want to springboard to talk about one of my current projects, which I'm collaborating with my friend and colleague Anya Lumba, who's also on this call. And we're working on a critical analysis of post-colonial and decolonial theory and juxtaposing that to anti-colonial analyses that come out of Marxism. I've been concentrating more on an analysis of decolonial theory as it looms so large in Latin American studies within the US, and I think has kind of also popularized discussions of coloniality more broadly. So I think some of what I see as the problems of this type of thinking, I think are very much connected to what I've tried to summarize about what I find so useful in Adolph's work. And in a nutshell, what I'm arguing is that some of these very influential traditions of anti-Marxist, post-colonial and decolonial thought that are very influential in the US Academy are really doing the work of radical recuperation. That is, they pose as radical, generally on the basis of their critique of racism, but in fact, they're reactionary. And that is, they work to ideologically recuperate popular anti-systemic struggles by obscuring their material stakes and ventriloquizing them with a theoreticist discourse that really severs ideology from its basis in class struggle. I'm also borrowing this term radical recuperator from Gabriel Rockhill, who's also a collaborator of mine, who has used this term really to talk about kind of the promotion of an anti-communist left intelligentsia and its promotion kind of by elites, including by the US state. And this idea that the kind of figure of the radical recuperator in theoretical thought works to also police the left border of critique, providing a kind of critique that seems like it captures, oppositional elements, but that invariably casts Marxist analysis and revolutionary socialism as being beyond the pale. And that's precisely what kind of anti-Marxist decolonial thought does. And I think there's also, Gabriel has used this term also really to talk about kind of French structuralist or post-structuralist thinkers and the role that they've played within the US Academy. And I think that's also relevant to this because a lot of the thinking that I'm talking about is very much influenced by kind of what we might refer to as sort of postmodernist thought and the kind of way that French structuralism has been metabolized by the US Academy. So I'm just going to go over just briefly a few points here before closing about what I want to argue about this kind of decolonial theory. And, I'm really focusing here on a kind of work of US-based academics that have really positioned themselves as the vanguard of this theory, people associated with the modernity, coloniality, decoloniality group like Walter Mignolo and Nelson Maldonado Torres. And this work is really explicitly anti-Marxist. Upon reading it, you would be left with the impression that Marxism is Eurocentric and antagonistic to struggles for decolonization, that historical struggles for socialism are distinct from projects of decolonization. And you would get the impression that a proper strategy for decolonization principally requires thinking differently, not organizing to build power, and certainly not attempting to take control of the state. So I want to just say these ideas about, Marxism being Eurocentric and all that, they're really blatant mischaracterizations of Marxism and its relation to anti-colonialism. It's sometimes so tendentious to the point to kind of to be laughable, like arguing that, for example, that the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, two of the most important anti-colonial revolutions in history, are Western phenomena, things like this. There's a kind of dogmatism to the Marxism that I want to kind of highlight here. And also just want to briefly mention, there's in addition to the kind of dismissal of Marxism, and as well as the dismissal of the importance of Marxism, particularly Third International Marxism and the Russian Revolution, for popularizing the idea of anti-colonialism and making an entire culture of anti-colonialism that has also been written about in post-colonial scholarship. In addition to, of course, the way that this narrative really invisibilizes the centrality of Marxism to anti-colonial struggles in the Third World, to anti-colonial Marxist thinkers in the Third World, etc. But I think a lot of this dismissal of Marxism happens via what I think is really a kind of red herring, which is this kind of crude geographic determinism that treats the geographic location of a concept's purported origin as determinant of its value for decolonial struggles. This idea that thought that comes from a European thinker can't be useful for anti-colonial struggles. I mean, this has been really critiqued as a kind of illogical way of thinking about how thought works. In the same way we don't say that like algebra is Persian, we don't have to say that, Marxism is European. These are forms of thought that evolve, acquire new meanings and associations, and shed others as they are transformed and used by people who live in distinct historical situations. And we can, work to understand that process, but we really can't understand it by simply condemning certain ideas, particular ideas that have been disseminated and developed all over the world, simply based on some kind of reified notion of the enunciation and the flattening of the world into Europe and its others. But again, I think this is a kind of a red herring, because I really think that the dismissal of Marxism is more fundamental, because there's this idea that any thought that comes from Europe can't be useful for thinking about decoloniality it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And it also doesn't make sense with the very European methodological basis that a lot of these theorists are operating with. As I said, a lot of their work is really coming out of kind of French postmodern thought and giving it a new spin. But I also wanted to note that this kind of determinism that casts European thought as unhelpful, as kind of basically gives it a kind of moral coding of bad, has its corollary in the presumption that epistemic tools for liberation, and I say epistemic tools because kind of liberation is oftentimes limited to the plane of thought in this work, that this kind of thinking must come from the Third World or from quote unquote indigenous thought. Now, precisely what thoughts and how these might conform a viable strategy of decolonization is rarely specified. And as other scholars who have critiqued decolonial theory have noted, some of these theorists who are making these pronouncements don't engage in any empirical investigation about indigenous thought and don't work in indigenous languages. So this is more a kind of prophetic strategy of saying, well, that I'll get to in a second. But I also want to say that this kind of makes sense because I think what is being proffered under the sign of quote unquote indigenous thought, just like other concepts like border thinking, subaltern thought, is really the kind of mythic promise of some kind of extra ideological subject that is somehow uncontaminated by Western thought. In other words, I think it's a figure that operates within the theorist's imagined confrontation between Western thought, considered bad, and its others, considered good. And so here it's really the kind of postmodernist fetishization of an abstract alterity, an abstract otherness, is really combined with the kind of warmed over trope of the noble savage, initially popularized in colonial discourse. And so indigeneity is really only valorized insofar as it can represent a space outside of Western capitalist modernity. And I'm just going to wrap up in a second. And just to note that this kind of representation of indigenous people as if they were outside of capitalist modernity, in this case, it's given a positive moral charge, but it's really a kind of very familiar trope of colonial ideology. it's been identified and roundly critiqued by Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui in her critique of decolonial theory. And she notes that kind of casting indigenous people outside of modernity in the way that this thinking does really ensnares them in indigenous stereotypes of the noble savage and as guardians of nature. And she says that while this invites an almost theatrical display of alterity, these kinds of representations enable elites' neutralization of struggles and demands of indigenous people, while casting them as multicultural adornments for neoliberalism. And I think that this kind of is very much in line with the kind of radical recuperative work that a lot of this thinking does to take, for example, indigenous struggles for power and land and cast them in terms of something that ultimately amounts to a thinking otherwise, right? So I'll go ahead and wrap up for now and turn it over to Adolph.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Ponce de León, for those far-reaching and illuminating remarks, which we'll definitely get back to after we hear from Professor Reed. Turning to Dr. Adolph Reed, I'm happy to bring him back to Villanova. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in issues of racism, US politics, and American studies. He's also taught at Yale, Northwestern, and the New School for Social Research during his long, influential, and iconoclastic career. A bit about his background: Professor Reed became interested in politics early in life. Born into a family of academics in New York, he often found himself discussing politics around the dinner table. When he became a student at the University of North Carolina, he launched his career as an activist, getting involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements and organizing for cafeteria workers at his school. More recently, I know he's campaigned for Bernie Sanders, Medicare for all, for canceling student debt, for voting rights, again, and of course, many other progressive issues. His activism has informed his many books. I'll name a few here. Class Notes, Posing as Politics and Other Thoughts on the American Scene, The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, W.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought. And his latest book, I'll mention, it's called The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. In it, he reflects on his own lived experience in New Orleans, and through his personal history and political acumen, we see America's apartheid system from the ground up. He's also a very well-known political commentator and writer on Black and progressive politics and wider issues, and has written in countless popular and, of course, scholarly articles. Just to name a few of the journals he's been in: The Nation, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New Labor Forum, Jacobin, The Black Agenda, New Yorker, New York Times, and I won't go on, every major newspaper. So anyway, I'm very happy to bring him back to Villanova, and welcome Professor Reed. I'll turn to you now.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. And it's quite nice to be back at Villanova. I just drove past there a week or two ago, but I'm there virtually now, and it's good to see you all. And thanks again for organizing this. And Jennifer, thanks very much for being part of it. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from your talk. I'm quite excited about following this new project. So whenever you have anything to share with people, I'll be happy to read it, because the decolonial stuff is like, one of my bugbears also. So let me begin by saying a couple things, just one kind of random. Karen may have given some of this away in the intro, but like I grew up in a household where I was given to understand, even before I had my first communion class, that without the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution, there would have been no decolonization after World War II, and there would have been no civil rights movement here in the U.S. Now, my father would sometimes take that an additional step. I won't go to that other step at this moment. I might be tempted to do it later, but I think that's absolutely the case. And one might say that even the idea of the third world itself was something of a compromise or a cop-out as a way to sidestep the question of imperialism. But perhaps we can discuss that more down the road. I would like to go back to, one other observation I wanted to make about the noble a quick comment like on the noble savage point that Professor Ponce de León made. It's absolutely correct, obviously, and it's also striking that the ways that contemporary pro-indigenous leftists in the North in particular, but also in the South, frankly, want to talk about indigenous populations is almost exact. Well, it certainly brings to mind the 19th century comparative method in anthropology, in which scholars believed that what they perceived as primitives in contemporary life were in fact versions of a more advanced societies or races ancestral forms, right? So the anthropologists, so many Victorian anthropologists thought that by studying so-called primitives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we could also get a window onto what our again in scare quotes, ancestors were like in the Stone Age or in small scale societies. So from that perspective, it's like racist garbage in and a racist garbage out in the 19th century, and lo and behold, now coming from the left in the 21st century, it's the same kind of racist garbage in and racist garbage out. And I think that's an ironic point to which I'll return in another setting. So I want to say a couple of things about race and how to think about it. Again, Professor Ponce de León laid my position out perfectly, so I don't need to state that again, but I will bounce off a couple of implications. One is that she pointed out, I argue that race is an expression of a typology, I guess, or a class of ideologies of ascriptive difference. That is, difference based on what populations supposedly are instead of what they do. I've suggested that it's kind of useful to think of taxonomic, or to advert the taxonomic metaphor when describing the relationship between race and these other ideologies of ascriptive difference, because especially in post-World War II America, we've all been given to understand that racism is a singular sui generis sin, right? That it's a conversation-stopping sin. It's one of a kind. It's sometimes scholars have described racism as our national disease, right? Or our original sin, actually, right? Scholars have called it. But what I've been arguing for a number of years is, how does race look if we think of it as just one point on an indifference curve of the ideologies of naturalized difference, right? Gender is certainly one that's familiar to people in our society. In the teens and 20s of the last century, feeble-mindedness was another racial equivalent, right? That is like an ideology, a discourse that, first of all, constructs groups as populations, or rather constructs populations as groups, and imputes to them definitive characteristics that are shared across the entire group, right? So they are essential characteristics, and that's what the critique of essentialism boils down to. And this is like the money shot, that those definitive characteristics explain why different populations are where they appear to be on a hierarchy of the distribution of good stuff and bad stuff, or of civic worth, in whatever society it is that they're in. So they are in effect just so stories. Race is a just so story, for instance. And I've often suggested that that when we read race, or see the word race, it could be helpful just as an exercise to read it as unicorn, because races are as real as unicorns are, right? And from that perspective, my friend and colleague Walter Ben Michaels argues that we should stop talking about race as a social construct, right? I mean, we don't say that, well, a unicorn is a social construct. We say there's no such thing as unicorn. and that's a point of view to consider. But then the question is, well, what does race do, right? And why does it stick around, right? What accounts for its staying power? And as with other ideologies of ascriptive hierarchy, by the way, the divine right of kings was another, and the great chain of being was yet another, right? Right. These are stories that emerge, right? Right. One can say, from a basic historical materialist perspective, you can say that these narratives, right? Since we know that one of the characteristics of Homo sapiens sapiens as a species is that we think through taxonomies, and we make them up and sort the world into taxonomies, which is how we make sense of it. It's a double-edged sword, but it's all we got, right? So we can say then that categories or narratives of ascriptive difference, like race or the divine right of kings or whatever, emerge through folk processes, right? Through ideas that develop within a population and last for a while, and seem true because, well, we know they're true because we know they're true, right? But folk understandings like that rise and fall, right? What accounts for those that develop staying power, like race, is that when they converge on the interests and perspectives of interests in a society that are powerful enough to make use of them, right? And that explains why race has played out the way it's played out. What does it do? Well, one thing that it does, thinking sociologically for a second, is that race provides a convenient explanation for existing inequalities, right? Because it gives a naturalized narrative about to explain why everyone in the society is where they are and is where they belong. So it is really like all these ascriptive ideologies are really just those stories. So that explains, the work that race has done, where it comes from, but it also can change over time, and the usefulness of it can change over time, right? As a narrative that persists, it thrives and survives to the extent that it connects with pragmatic interests. So, in fact, I mean, apropos of Jennifer's last comments, what I'm working on a book chapter now in which I'm arguing that that commitment to white supremacy as the foundation of American society does, or the work that commitment did for the minions of the Southern ruling class in the 19th century, who installed Confederate commemorations and statues and the like around the region. That same commitment to the transhistorical power and immutability of white supremacy does the same kind of ideological work for many of the activists who now want to get rid of the monuments and the statuary, in service to a conviction that the main enemy of racial equality today is white supremacy instead of capitalist political economy, which was the point that the 19th century Bourbons, who erected the regime of white supremacy, were trying to impose at the same time. So it can work for different class interests, but it never works for the interests of the masses of the masses of the working people. Yeah, I want to say a couple other things about that as well. One is that another point that Jennifer made that's really crucial here is the role that race and other discourses of ascriptive difference play in labor market formation. I came across a number of years ago a racial adaptability chart that was prepared by an industrial psychology consulting firm in Pittsburgh in 1925 for a metal tubing company that on one axis lists something like 36 different races, the vast majority of them white, or supposedly. And on the other axis, a number of job performances and conditions of work. And what this firm did, and this is what the fields, by the way, of industrial relations and industrial psychology, this is the kind of practice that those fields were born into, right? Of creating labor markets or creating populations as labor markets, as pools of labor defined by characteristics that were imputed to these gatherings of people as though they were part of their essence. So, I mean, for instance, probably most students haven't thought about this, but one might ask, well, why do cities like Chicago, Gary, Cleveland, Buffalo, Baltimore, Pittsburgh have such large Polish or populations of Polish descent? The one common thread is steel mills. And now there's no Polish gene for steel making, but what there was labor suppliers constructed the idea that Poles work well in making steel, and then that becomes a basis for creation of a Polish American population that's steel workers. Probably more of you have heard the stories about Italians being good stonemasons, right? And there's all kinds of feeding back here. Well, all these notions have their roots in political economy, and construction and maintenance, right? Managing of pools of labor. One other observation I want to make about this point, and I'm going to shut up in a minute because I'd like to have our discussion, but is that a friend of mine who was for a number of years director of the New Orleans Workers Center found a great way to talk to American workers about the fear of immigrants, right? And his point was always that no, the immigrant workers aren't trying to take your job. What's happening is the employer is turning your job into something different, but into a job that only someone who has no rights and no recourse would be available as a candidate for. So it's not the immigrant, it's the employer. And one other observation like that, Lee Benford, an anthropologist at the College of Staten Island, did a really nice book a few years ago called Tomorrow We All Go to the Harvest, I think. And it's a study of a labor migration program run in Southern Ontario, between Jamaica and I forget what state it is in Mexico. I think it might be Jalisco, but I'm not sure. And what's fascinating about this or about the ethnography, well, many things are, but one thing that's fascinating about it is that the growers have, and like this is a current program, right? So I'm not talking about the 19th century here, but the growers have found distinctions to make between the Jamaican workers and the Mexican workers based on ideology. One of them is a very old one, right? And it's a cliche, but the idea is that they think the Mexican workers are better at picking stuff that comes out of the ground, and the Jamaican workers are better at picking stuff that's on trees. I mean, you could be a little more original, really, than that one. But the other one is that the Mexican workers, they believe, are more tractable, more docile, less rambunctious. And they attribute this to culture, to race, right, to whatever, to everything in the world, except for the fact that French and French and English are the languages in Ontario, not Spanish. Very few of the Mexican workers speak any English at all, practically none, speak any French. And not only do Jamaican workers speak English, but there's a very large Jamaican population in the province of Ontario. So if Jamaican workers want to leave and go hang out and be AWOL from the barracks, they have many more opportunities to do so. But this is just another slightly defamiliarized illustration of how these narratives work and the work that they actually do. Now, the big questions, I think, the bigger questions would have to do with how all this plays out in a contemporary American politics, where we've seen since at least 2015 what appears to be a sharpening distinction between race as a discourse for pursuit of equality and class as a discourse for the pursuit of equality, and they've come seemingly into increasing conflict with each other, to the extent that, Joyanne Reed, for instance, and she's not alone, but she's just the convenient whipping horse that comes to mind, she and others have argued in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential race that any reference to a working class in America is in fact a veiled attempt to placate racist white people, which means, among other things, that blacks and brown people, therefore by definition, can't be part of the working class, right? And this is also a problem as old as the end of the 19th century, right? The historian Michael West, who teaches at Holy Cross, did a great book a few years ago called The Education of Booker T. Washington. And one of his key arguments is that Washington sort of gave birth to the idea of race relations, which is an idea that we think about now. It kind of rolls off our tongues. We'll all kind of gnash our teeth and wring our hands about the state of American race relations, and then no one ever stops to think, well, what does the construct race relations mean? How can races relate, right? There are two problems there. One, as I said a few minutes ago, since races don't exist, they can't really relate. But if they did exist, the question would be, well, how could they relate? My son often points out that there are more Black Americans, or more Americans classified as Black, than there are people in Canada. So how do 42 Black Americans think one thing, right? Can anyone imagine that 40 million Canadians think one thing? Of course not. Nice and kind and gentle as they are. But what this comes down to is that a kind of perverse reversal of the way that race ideology does anti-working class work, from the way that it did it at the end of the 19th century to the way that it does it now. Like, it does it kind of the opposite way now. And ironically, I think in the late 19th century, the objective was to try to read white workers into the aspirations of the ruling class, to pit them against non-whites. And then, by the way, the category of non-whites, if you ever get a chance to look at the racial adaptability chart, I mean, the category of non-whites had a lot more groups in it prior to 1924 than it's had since then, right? You might be shocked to know that probably half of modern Europe would not have been considered white before 1924. So if any of you are happy about being white, you better go home and talk to your grandmother. But anyway, but today, in the sign of what, under the guise of the assertion that the only kinds of inequalities that warrant remedial action in America today are those that can be understood as disparities according to either race or a gender. Then in that context, as again, my friend Walter Ben Michaels and I have argued, if that's your standard of what a just society is, then that means that a society could be considered just if 1% of the population controlled 95% of the resources, providing that 1% were half female, 12% Black, 14% Latino, and so forth and so on. And certainly in an ethics course, I assume that's an ideal of a just society that's as defensible as any other one is. It's certainly, but I don't think it's one that I want to put myself on the line to fight for. So I mean, let me stop there and let's have some conversation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor Reed, for your words and wisdom, giving us a lot to think about. And I'm sure a lot of people have questions for you in our remaining minutes. So chime in, anyone. Let's see our gallery view.
Yeah, as I often said in my own classes, not everyone at once. I can't stand pandemonium.
Or perhaps Professor De León, would you like to say something?
Sure. I mean, I had a couple of questions. I have a question I'd like to follow up with, if that's okay, unless somebody else has a question. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, Adolph, about kind of contemporary discourses and the way that anti-racism functions, I was also thinking about the article you wrote a couple years ago that was about the kind of absence of anti-imperialism among the US left. And you were writing it in the context of kind of yet another renewed attempt at US aggression against Venezuela's government.
Right.
And
yeah, I just read that a couple of days ago, right? For obvious reasons now.
Yeah. No,
so it's fresh in my mind.
Yeah. And it's a really great analysis. But I'm also wondering if you see how you see kind of, and I was also thinking about the way that sort of so much of the discussions around threats of US fascism get kind of reduced to racism, and how you might see this sort of naturalization of US imperialism operating, how you see that operate within kind of US political culture and how it relates to the way that anti-racism kind of dominates thinking about injustice.
Well, yeah, that's a great question and a real problem. But before I respond to it, just a quick thing. This is a shameless plug, but I want to mention our podcast. It's called Class Matters Podcast, and it's available at classmatterspodcast.org. It's a product of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. And our tagline for the podcast is that we're the place to come to discuss what the country would look like if it were run or if we're governed by and for the working class. And we just recorded the fourth episode yesterday. And two of the first, they've been anchored in conversations with progressive trade union leaders, but I think some of you will will find it useful, interesting, helpful. And once again, it's classmatterspodcast.org. But on the question, yeah, the first answer off the top of my head is demoralizing, right? I mean, going back to the first Gulf War, when the anti-war movement broke out, right, in 1990, 91, I attended like a demonstration that a couple of my students were involved in organizing. And some of the right-wing students demanded that the anti-war students give them the microphone so that they could have equal time, because that's what their understanding of democracy was. And one of these kids actually gave up the microphone. So I thought, okay, well, we have a problem here of political culture. So that's not necessarily about imperialism, but I thought about this a lot too, like after 20 years of nonstop war in the Middle East, the last numbers I saw were something like more than 3 million people had been deployed overseas in a war, and I think there were more than 4.5 million total deployments, which was more than Vietnam. So now we've got like a generation of people who have grown up with war as part of the natural backdrop for them, and with shrinking access to higher education and to jobs, and I mean, the decent jobs, like the lure of going into the military is even greater, and so forth and so on. And I've noticed really since Nicaragua in the 80s, right, there's a strain among American leftists, not just liberals, right, but people who understand themselves to be on the left, that inclines them to think that popular movements elsewhere need to articulate themselves with an eye toward winning a propaganda war in the American corporate media, right? And I'm sorry, that's never what I've never been able to process that as anything other than another expression of American imperialism, right? So there's that. And it's certainly the case now. Like a good friend of mine who taught an intro to Latin American studies for many, many years said that this one course that he taught to undergraduates was basically a compendium of U.S. interventions like in Latin America since the late 19th century. And he said at every step along the way, the students would understand, and then you get to the end of the course and it's always the same. Oh God, well, it's so tragic that the U.S. is so naive that we always get, snookered by the worst people, right? So there's just a lot to overcome, right? I mean, there's a lot to overcome, and I mean the governing parties or the parties of the ruling class, right, have an understandable perspective that that governments in other states have or should be more concerned about the well-being and desires of U.S. corporations than they are about the people in their own countries. It's disturbing when progressives in the U.S. seem to operate the same way, and I mean that's the way. So like from the beginning, from Chavez's first election victory in Venezuela, and the margins were always greater than any American president in my lifetime has gotten, right? And the same is true with Evo Morales in Bolivia and Korea, and the PT was a little bit different, but time and time again, like we see what comes from our national security apparatus and the government and the steno pool that they run, like in the corporate newsfotainment industry, that any government that doesn't follow US dictates is illegitimate and is by definition a dictatorship. But you kind of expect that from them, right? You don't expect it from the left media. But I think that's been a huge problem for us. And I think chickens may be coming home to roost about that, disposition now, with respect to the war in Ukraine. I hope that's an adequate response. Other questions or comments?
Maybe comment on the war in Ukraine.
No, I'm not touching that.
Well, how about talking about the way our working class college students, and by that I mean all of them, because they're all going to be working,
right?
How are they being constructed, or in subjectivity kind of terms, or in terms of agency? What is the sort of capitalist hope for them, or prediction? What kind of boxes do they want to put them in? Now that we probably have a lot of students in the audience here that'd like to hear the plans that capitalists have for them after they graduate.
Well, I'll bet the students have some ideas, so I'd like to hear what some of them think. What do you plan to do after you graduate?
Yeah.
Speak up, any one of you.
Come on, speak up. Dream job.
Yes.
I hope to get a job at a fashion magazine.
Okay. Sounds good. And what year are you now?
I'm a sophomore.
Okay, cool. And do you have connections? Like, have you been trying to track down the internship stuff and that kind of thing?
Sorta.
Yeah, well, you have time. Yeah, or anybody else? Yes. Hi, Sam.
So I grew up in Lebanon, and
Yeah.
Lebanon is, everybody looks the same, right?
Right,
Everybody
right.
looks the same, but they've figured other ways to classify society and to
Right.
have the fights and arguments and wars. And what I find my frustration living in North America is as been suggested, the biggest social justice struggle most folks seem to focus on is the issue of racism without looking at it from, again, the class and resources, fighting over resources issue. So any advice on what messaging might work beside, giving folks your papers on how to get them to focus on the problems of capitalism and the problem of resources versus just how people look different.
Yeah, well, can I say two things? One, like, I've spent a fair amount of time in Beirut and a little bit of time in Jordan, and one of the things that fascinates me, from the standpoint of studying race, right, is that, like, you see the equivalent, but without phenotype, right? Sunni, Shia, Christian, right? But also, most fascinating to me was the figure of the Sri Lankan, right? Because Sri Lankans, as you know, can be from Sri Lanka, they can be from the Philippines, they can be from the Horn of Africa, but the Sri Lankan is a generic designation of a servant, right? And also day labor. I spent like months trying to find out where the day laborers were in Beirut. And of course, I mean, as you know, this was 20 years ago, but they were coming back and forth across the border from Syria, right, on a daily basis with the armed guards watching over them. So yeah, but on the substantive question, So I tell you what I found, that when I talk to working people, like I don't need to be concerned about it. Right. I mean, workers, but like if you talk to people about, and I know this sounds like a cliche, but it's really true, that if you talk to people about the bread and butter issues that concern them in their lives, right, then you can you can step around having to address the thorny pro forma, right? I mean, race questions. And I mean, look, like we actually won, we as the Labor Party won a ballot line for a South Carolina Labor Party. And that required getting signatures of at least 10,000 registered voters in the state on petitions to tell the Secretary of State that it should recognize a Labor Party in South Carolina. We got more than 16,500. And the modal experience that we had in talking to people who would sign it was to say, and this is without regard to race, age, or whatever, gender, that they were excited to see that there was some political entity in South Carolina that really wanted to talk about things that people are really concerned about: jobs, housing, healthcare, education. And it's only when we are operating within our own class, really, and in the professional managerial strata, where the political economy of racial representation lives. That's its natural home, right? I mean, I am sure you've had this experience in your union too, and even in your school, that you can tell that when somebody bristles at what you're talking about, that seems that it might in some way bear on race, the bristling is connected with a perceived possible challenge to the legitimacy of whoever the racial representative is, right? So, I mean, I think, so look, it's tough, right? But I think the only way we can get to where we need to get to is just to refuse the conversation, basically. And I know that sounds a lot simpler than it would be in practice, but I still think that's where we need to get to.
Thank you.
Well, it's been about an hour, so I know some people will have to leave. I don't know if Jennifer and Adolph would stay on a little bit longer for maybe 10 more minutes of conversation, or you too.
Yeah, I can do it. Sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I would just say those who have to leave, go ahead, and then maybe others can turn on their camera and we can get some conversation going, some more questions with our scholar here.
That sounds good.
Maybe we'll, oh, Gabriel, go ahead.
I was just curious. Hi, everyone. I was just curious. Adolph, you said in your opening comments, you mentioned kind of in passing that the reference to the third world is a cop-out to avoid talk of imperialism. I definitely wanted to follow up on that to get your thoughts more concretely on what you were alluding to. And kind of more generally, of course, a lot of the conversation is so helpful for relating racism to international labor pools. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more. It's been one of the leitmotifs, but maybe not as developed as much, about how then also racism relates to imperialism. I feel like it's been floating a little bit in the background with the reference to Ukraine, of course, the discussion of Venezuela and other such things. So I don't know if you want to address both of the questions, or if Jennifer, you want to weigh in as well more directly on the question of how race and more specifically how US imperialism targets different populations and sort of actually shift some of the kind of target populations for subhumanization.
Right. Why don't you go first, Jennifer?
On the question of imperialism and racism, I mean, I think I'm really thinking about US imperialism, just, I think, racial ideologies have been a kind of, long been in the arsenal of, imperialism. And I think it's also, and I guess just going back to my earlier critique of decolonial thought, it's also really important to analytically distinguish imperialism from racism, because one of the things that I think that thinking is doing is trying to collapse them in many ways. And kind of even replacing the vocabulary that we have for talking about imperialism with the vocabulary that's more about Eurocentrism or coloniality as this kind of structure. So, which is quite distinct. I mean, this kind of idea that you would, I think when we think about the history of imperialism, which we, understand as an economic system, right, that has generated all kinds of ideologies to legitimize itself and to kind of gain the consent, also of portions of the international working class to kind of be on board with colonial projects and such. I mean, there's been all kinds of racial ideologies, but from the kind of discourses of civilization versus barbarism to the kind of even ideologies that are more applied towards the landscapes in which people live rather than the people themselves, right? It's like a really, so I think this is just one example where you see this kind of variance. And then speaking, I guess, but I also think, anyway, I think I gather my thoughts for a second. So I'm going to turn that over to Adolph, and then I might circle back.
Cool. Okay. Well, now go to the to the third world question. Well, because the idea was developed out of this notion that there was a block of nations that were being courted, but by the East or the first world, second world, which was the Soviet or the socialist world, and wanted to carve out like an independent voice for themselves in between. And my colleague at Penn, actually, I guess I should say, Jennifer, Penn colleague Bob, Vitalis, has done really interesting work on this, right? On what he argues is the fantasy of the Bandung Conference and the organization of non-aligned nations. Because the reality is that there wasn't, that space between the first and second worlds didn't really exist. And I mean, to that extent, I'd come eventually to see the third world notion as a compromise or a cop-out, as I said, because it's like, because it rested on a premise that there was a third path, right, that wasn't capitalist and it wasn't socialist, right? And then, as you know, I mean, some cases like Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, but others tried to sort of put together a kind of hybrid communalist, socialist, non-capitalist path to development. But yeah, second, what Jennifer said too. I mean that racism and imperialism just kind of come together. But I think I might even suggest that they come together, or that the foundation, or it's not like there's an autonomous racism and a semi-autonomous or autonomous drive to imperialism that sort of get married or whatever. It's that is the drive to exploitation is the same, right? Both in the domestic face of capitalism and the trans-border or transnational face of capitalism, and that ideologies of ascriptive difference do the same work in both domains, right? So I mean, for instance, like in Victoria, I'm sorry the students are gone because this might have been nice for them to hear, but in British Victorian race theory, right? Race theorists were absolutely convinced that the English working class was racially different from the aristocracy. And few things tell you more clearly what race is than that. That and the fact that Serbs and Croatians imagine that they can see the differences between one another. Sunni and Shia, although the differences between Sunni and Shia are more real and are also class differences, right? But Tutsis and Hutus, right? I mean, yeah, anyway. I babble on, but back to you, Jennifer.
No, that was just making me, I mean, what you said was just that the kind of, I was thinking of, I mean, your own writing on that, Adolph, or like Domenico Lucerto's writing on the kind of colonial racism developed by the British being a kind of, like exactly you said, a displacement from the racist ways of thinking about the proletariat, right? And I guess I also just wanted to say back to the point of saying that that there isn't some kind of, like that's what you said, some kind of racism that exists somehow separately that is then marshaled for this. I also think it's really important, particularly just in light of the discourses that we've talked about, to think of the ways that imperialism also operates without racism, like that's not always the kind of like, I mean, that's not always the, let's say, the most salient kind of ideological manifestation that it has. And just thinking of, the ways, just the ways that unequal exchange works, or the ways there's a lot of, especially when we think about the ways that it is sanctioned as well within, by elites against their, quote unquote, own people, right, within nations, that is not always a kind of racializing, or primarily a kind of racist project, even if in certain manifestations from the US it's perceived that way, right? Because
Right. Yeah. Definitely. I see the Colorado contingent is with us. It's kind of interesting. Hi, Kenny and Janice. Other comments or questions?
In the chat, there was a follow-up that Christina posted as an extension of the last question. Could you say more about the implications of contemporary left activism that lacks an anti-imperialist lens?
Who wants to take that? I think any one of the three of us could take it, actually. Well, yeah, I don't know, Jennifer, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, I think it's, I mean, just I think it's just thinking of some of I'm just thinking of some of the things you said, Adolph, like how shocking it is that there's a kind of, like particularly like thinking of US interventions in Honduras and back in the coup in Bolivia, back in the coup in Paraguay, the attempted coups in Venezuela. There's it's kind of seems to be such a blind spot, and a lot of that, I think, is because of this kind of successful propaganda of the U.S. corporate media. I also think it's because of a longstanding successful kind of propaganda, campaign that enshrines democracy in this kind of very abstract sense of, democracy versus authoritarianism as a kind of framework within which to understand the world. And then the kind of very selective ways in which that gets mobilized, whereas discussions of socialism and the kind of, or transitions to socialism are really, I think, written out of that. And also I think they're kind of misunderstood by the left as well, who are oftentimes there's a tendency for this kind of purity politics sometimes in the left that want socialist projects to like immediately look like some kind of utopian thing, as if they weren't transitions from capitalism, right?
Yep.
And also some kinds of these, I think, very, like I was trying to say, sort of crude ideas of what like democracy looks like versus, which sometimes really, I think there's also a kind of anti-statism that is, or a kind, even a like anarchist tendency on the US left that has such a kind of dogmatic suspicion of state projects, but also a kind of lack of appreciation for what the nation state might mean in a kind of anti-neocolonial project in the global peripheries. Yeah,
so I think you hit the nail on the head and said everything that needs to be said, but showing that I'm still a professor, I'm going to say something else anyway. But what I'm just to add, frankly, but because everything that you mentioned is I think hits at the heart of the problem. And part of it is the emergence of human rights discourse, right? And human rights imperialism and interventionism even, and memory decay, right? So like I haven't recovered yet from when a few weeks ago, I saw Condoleezza Rice say that when Russia invaded a sovereign nation, that was already automatically a war crime. And I thought, as people would say when I was coming up, how can you hold your mouth to say something like that, right? But there's that, and I mean, human rights thing is real, and that anti-statism is a serious problem. And what that means is you add it all up, and like this is another song I've been singing for a while. There is no left in the U.S. unless you inflate the language of left, of what counts as left, to the equivalent of, I don't know, like the Reichsmark in 1929, right? And so I've like taken to curmudgeonly, describing what there is here as that blob, that phenomenon that occupies the cultural space that a left would occupy if there were one in the U.S. But I think one entailment of that people kind of overlook, it's like the good news within the bad news, is that because there is no left, like we have to face up to the fact that we can't have any impact on anything, right? Like we couldn't have any impact on the struggle for the Build Back Better bill, right? I mean, that was very clear. We couldn't have any impact on the 2020 presidential election. That was also clear. And while that's a demoralizing admission of our weakness, that there's also something a little emancipating about it. Like, because leftists in this country act like there's some audience out there waiting to hear what they think about stuff. And there isn't. So like, I don't have to follow the body count in Ukraine on a daily basis, except out of my own concern about, as a citizen, about being drawn closer and closer to the brink of nuclear war, right, or whatever, or a lot of other stuff that we don't need to follow, the daily news and be prepared to dictate statements to the press, and because as leftists rather, we're going to be in the same position tomorrow, no matter what happens today, right? Unless the fascist coup comes, in which case we'll be counting down to our execution, basically. But so from that perspective, I mean, I think it's probably just as well for anti-imperialist interests that the left in the U.S. is no stronger than it is, because of everything that you pointed to, Jennifer, as well as the human rights thing, right? Right. I mean, because I'm sure that those of us who are left here, who remain here, can recall the Darfur moment, right, with that hoax, and of how many people who wanted to think of themselves as being progressive, thought that buying something to express their opposition to a non-existent genocide was militant left action. That's kind of where we are now. Once again, classmatterspodcast.org.
Absolutely. I've got it in our chat.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, both for coming and for the discussion and for everyone who stayed. And